The Mountain is the strongest man in the Seven Kingdoms. Nearly 8 feet tall, Sir Gregor's strength is so vast that he can hack men in half with a single swipe of his sword and crush a man's skull with his bare hands. To say he is the strongest man in Westeros is no exaggeration. However, if the Mountain is the strongest man in Westeros, then Sandok the Shadow is easily the strongest man in Lys. Raised as a slave in the death pits of Meereen, Sandok stands 7 feet tall with over 100 winds to his name, killing the likes of lions, bears, wolves, and wyverns, all with his only weapons being stones. Although separated by hundreds of years of history, one may stop to wonder, if these men were to do battle, who would emerge victorious? The answer may surprise you. Today we'll find out just that, as these giants duel in the most powerful matchup the known world has ever seen. In order to determine who will win this epic clash, we must first know our challengers. The Mountain is perhaps the largest man to have existed. Almost 8 feet, or 2.4 meters tall, and easily north of 400 pounds, or 180 kilograms, Sir Gregor rides to battle a massive stallion often as ill-tempered as the man himself. He wields a massive 6-foot-long greatsword. Originally intended as a two-handed weapon, the Mountain chooses to wield it with one hand, as to use a massive oaken shield as well. His armor is the thickest, heaviest plate mail in the Seven Kingdoms, so much so that no normal man could move, let alone fight in such a suit. Underneath this, he wears chainmail and boiled leather. Altogether, on his stallion with full armor and a titanic shield and blade, the Mountain that rides is the closest thing to a medieval tank. The Mountain is said to be, by many accounts, a dim and slow man, with Jaime Lannister being quoted as saying Gregor could barely understand full sentences. While this surely was in some part a jest, Robb Stark said Gregor was without a single strategic thought in his head. Despite this lack of intelligence, the Mountain had excellent warrior's instincts, and was fearsome in his temperament to match, being described on multiple accounts as, quote, a mad dog, due to his attitude and the fact that his house sigil is 3 hounds on a yellow field. The Mountain's greatest asset will be his strength and size, but it would be wrong to say he will be without speed, as Bronn is quoted as saying, he's quicker than you'd expect for a man of that size. You would be hard-pressed to find a more evil man than the Mountain. Only leaving his keep for war and tourneys, it could be said that he lives only for violence. A torturer and defiler of women, among many other awful things, the Mountain is no stranger to excessive violence. Although not much of a tactician, the Mountain's various other attributes make up for his small mind. While he may not be armed with strategy, his nearly impenetrable armor and shield, coupled with the massive reach granted by his greatsword, make him exceptionally formidable. Given that he uses his massive blade in one hand, he will have the reach of a spear with the versatility of a sword, enabling him to make tight movements with the weapon and fight from whichever range he deems fit. Even if his sword is to be evaded, damaging the man is extremely unlikely, as his heavy armor and shield will block most attacks for him, and Gregor is still equally deadly in hand-to-hand combat, as well as being known to be able to snap bone with his bare hands. Given that pound for pound, bone is harder than steel, it gives little hope to any of the Mountain's opponents who will be relying on heavy armor. All of these would be difficult enough to face, assuming he is not mounted on a horse. If mounted, he will try to ride down an enemy fighter. Short of this, he will maintain distance and use his heavy armor to keep him safe while attempting a killing blow with his sword. If this is equally ineffective, the Mountain will use his bare hands to rip his opponents apart, limb from limb. A terrifying thought for a normal man, but maybe not so terrifying for Sandok the Shadow. Less is known of the Shadow than the Mountain. Black of skin and hair, much of his life remains unrecorded, as he was raised as a slave. His lips and tongue have also been removed, making it impossible for him to tell us the story himself. We do know some things, however. He drank the blood of men he had slain, and once ripped a man's throat out with his teeth after his sword had shattered. And even more horrific visage, considering his mutilated face is covered in scars. 7 feet tall, or 2.1 meters, Sandok the Shadow is roughly a foot shorter than the Mountain. This may be less of a disadvantage than one may initially think. The Shadow has slain wyverns with not more than a stone. While varying by species, brindled wyverns may grow up to be 30 feet long and are related to dragons, although they do not breathe fire. So deadly are these creatures, they have been dubbed the tyrants of the southern skies, and are one of the reasons why Sothorios is so thinly populated. Sandok had slain several of these creatures using only stones. As to say, he is used to fighting above his weight class. The Shadow is not a small man in his own right. Nearly all muscle, the physical power of the Shadow is not to be underestimated. Sandok, to be sure, is not as physically powerful as the Mountain. To what degree exactly it is hard to glean, but one thing that is more obvious is that his prowess and skill in battle will be much greater. Given that much of his combat experience was in the death pits of Marine as a slave, it is safe to assume much of the fighting the Shadow has done is with little to no weapons or armor, yet still, the man felled beasts substantially larger than himself. With this, we can assume that the speed and accuracy of Sandok is to be unmatched. Although lethal, Sandok was no brute, being known to play sad notes on a strange cello-like instrument. Given this, it is safe to assume that Sandok has a better understanding of rhythm as well, and may very well use that to time a crucial counter on a larger opponent such as the Mountain. While mute and illiterate as well, we may also assume that the Shadow is at least somewhat more intelligent than the Mountain, as he was able to learn an instrument without being able to read sheet music. It was a different sort of music Sandok the Shadow played defending young King Aegon III over the dry moat. Slaying legions of men, it was said to look less like a sword fight and more a farmer reaping grain. That night, his chosen instruments were a tall black shield of nightwood and a great curved sword of Valyrian steel with a dragon bone hilt. This speaks to the grace of his movement, effortlessly cutting through scores of opponents while suffering no injury. The Shadow did not get his namesake merely for his complexion, but for his ability to move about silently and with lethal intent. He makes no noise save for the whistling of his blade, with every cut slashing through mail as if it were parchment. Always moving, several men working together were unable to land a single effective blow against the Shadow. Sandok relies less on heavy armor and more so a fluid, movement-based, and ruthlessly effective fighting style. Never still, the Shadow will employ nimble movement to strike at critical points of his enemy. Finding gaps in armor will be no challenge for Sandok, and despite his size, he will remain a very difficult target himself. If there were any man who would be able to fell the Mountain, it would be Sandok the Shadow. So shall the Shadow eclipse the Mountain, or will the Mountain stand tall over the Shadow? Let's find out. Here's how an encounter between these legendary warriors may play out. The Mountain and his men set up camp after a day of riding. As the twilight slowly turns to night, a great fire burns in the center of the camp. The Mountain sits against a great tree of oak to rest while a few of his men finish making camp. His armor hits the wood with a thud, and he draws his knife, the size of a sword for most men, and proceeds to hack lazily at the air, muttering about killing someone. Although on the warpath, it had been several days since the Mountain had murdered anyone, a rare occurrence. When the pavilion was erected, a soldier strayed from the camp to collect more wood for the fire. While gathering kindling, the soldier paused for a moment. There was a bitter chill going through the air, and the man shuddered. Reaching at the base of a shrub to collect tinder, a jet-black hand jutted from the foliage and pulled the soldier directly onto a straight, honed dagger. Shredding through his neck, going in one side and out the other, the soldier could muster no sound but a wet gargle. He was held there for a moment, and then gently laid to the earth. The Shadow had made his first move. Darting silently through the trees, the Shadow closed the distance on the encampment. He peered through the brush. Including Sir Gregor, there were 11 men present. Then, the cold eyes melted back into the woods. One soldier was settling the horses for the night. When the leads were tied, the man turned back to camp, but a massive arm wrapped around his entire head and clamped hard. The Shadow began to saw through the man's neck until he hit the bone. 10. Another of the Mountain's men was just pulling up his trousers from urinating on a tree when he spotted the corpse. His face turned to shock, and his mouth began to open, but quick as lightning, a knife flew through the air and buried itself deep in the soldier's eye socket. The man, and his trousers, fell to the ground. 9. There were a good deal of men in tents, with 2 sitting out to set up watch. The Mountain's face had adopted a scowl as he was thrusting at the air with more vigor. Holding his knife in reverse, he pretended to stab down into a man's chest. One watchman leaned lazily against a spear, staring about the forest. Then, from the tree line above, the shadow fell, landing behind him. Despite his size, the shadow landed silently as a cat thrust his arms under the soldier's own, wrapping his arms around the back of his head. He leaned forward as far as he could, pushing down hard, snapping the man's spine in half. 8. There was a loudly audible snap, and the other watchman's head darted immediately to the scene. This time, a shout rang out. "Vezin!" was all the man could get out before Sandok was upon him and cleaved his head in 2. 7. A commotion went up in the tents as men darted out. Some had their armor only half on, but all were armed. The Mountain's men stormed Sandok, attempting to encircle him. With his long curved Valyrian steel blade already shot with crimson, Sandok began his song. A man launched an overhead strike, and Sandok sidestepped and removed his hand with a curt blow from his blade. The man fell to the ground screaming. Another soldier swung at his side with a sickle-like weapon. Sandok caught it with his own blade, pushing the attack off center, and then curved the spike of his own sword into the man's skull. 6. A javelin was thrown at the shadow, but was caught. Spinning, as to redirect the momentum of the spear, Sandok hurled the weapon back and buried it under the ribcage of the sender. 5. By this point, 3 men had managed to encircle him. One soldier lunged with a sword strike. His blade was met with a clash against Sandok's steel, and the shadow darted out of the way, allowing the soldier attacking him from his rear to dig his sword into his ally. With the man stuck trying to remove his blade from his comrade, Sandok seized the opportunity, gripping the hilt of his blade with 2 hands and stabbing that man in the back. Sandok then threw the corpses onto the remaining man before the bodies fell. Trapped under the carcasses, he could do nothing as Sandok opened his chest and gouged him through the heart. 4, 3, 2. The man on the ground remained screaming at the stump where his hand used to be, blaring obscenities until a titanic iron-plated boot fell on his head, flattening it, and the Mountain towered above the fresh body in silence. 1. A hard scowl painted Gregor's face as he gazed at the veiled obsidian figure before him. Sandok's blade glinted in the firelight as a stream of blood trickled off it. Dark eyes met the violent stare of Gregor Clegane. The Mountain hefted his massive oaken shield, closed his helmet's visor, and walked calmly towards Sandok, opening the duel with a horizontal strike aimed at the torso of the shadow. Stepping back, the attack was easily dodged. Sandok closed the considerable distance of Gregor's massive blade and attempted 2 quick strikes, hooking the tip of the curved blade around his shield. Both were deflected by the large barrier, and Gregor shoved his shield forward against the shadow. This launched Sandok back a considerable distance. Ever agile, the shadow remained on his feet and continued his assault. Ceaseless in his movements, Sandok weaved in and out as Gregor continued to hack at him, remaining protected behind his stalwart shield. Becoming frustrated, once more Gregor swung at Sandok. Leaping above the strike, the shadow narrowly dodged it, and Gregor's blade lopped a tree clean in half and was buried in a mighty oak. Behind it, where the war sword was stuck for a moment. Before Gregor could wrench his blade free, Sandok buried his own weapon in the Mountain's shield and attempted to remove the barricade from Gregor's grasp. Gregor did not let go. Instead, he shoved his full weight forward, dashing Sandok to the ground and landing on top of him. Rising to his knees, the Mountain abandoned his sword, and with the shield wedged between the 2 of them, lifted it up and brought it down again and again, repeatedly bashing the shadow. As the massive slab of oak raised once more, Sandok's legs found freedom from the immense heft of his opponent. He planted both feet on the oak that separated them, and heaved with all his might. Against an ordinary man, the Mountain would not have budged, but Sandok is no ordinary man. While not sent reeling, the Mountain was moved just enough for Sandok to scramble to safety. Sandok had gained distance, and while given a short reprieve to collect himself from the battering, Gregor used this opportunity to mount his stallion, and now wielded a cruel iron-tipped war lance. Bellowing, the Mountain that rides thundered at the shadow. Holding his ground, Sandok remained motionless, and at the last possible moment, leapt out of the way of certain death. Tucking and rolling, Sandok landed on his belly, but with haste, rose to his feet, arming himself with the sword of one of the mountain's fallen men-at-arms. Gregor pulled the reins of the testy stallion, circling back for a second charge. This time, the Shadow was less passive, and replied with a charge of his own. He ran towards the mountain. On his steed, Gregor was nearly 10 feet tall. As the two met, Sandok dropped, falling on his back. The lance tip passed only inches above his face. The Shadow slid through the legs of the horse and slashed its hind leg, sending the stallion and his gigantic rider tumbling to the dirt. Gregor's immense weight broke the horse's neck, and he fell with a loud crash. Wasting no time, the Shadow grabbed the discarded sickle of the mountain's former soldier and hurled it at Gregor. The blade twirled through the air. Already on his feet, the mountain merely raised his shield, and the barricade caught the weapon as it was planted deep, further splintering the wood. By the time Gregor raised his head to gain sight of his foe again, Sandok had closed the distance. Pulling the blade free, the Shadow spun around Gregor to his right flank. All in one motion, Sandok cut the leather straps attaching Gregor's helmet to the rest of his armor and yanked it free from his head. Gregor turned to face him, and Sandok was once again met with the malevolent stare. The mountain grabbed the edges of his shield with both hands and slammed it against Sandok, cracking the wood in two and splintering the shield to ruins. Now stumbling, but still composed, Sandok continued to press the attack. He launched a series of strikes aimed at the exposed head of the mountain, still weaving in and out, full well understanding a well-placed blow from Gregor, even unarmed, could be as damaging as the most lethal of weapons. Many of these strikes were deflected off the monstrous plate armor Sir Gregor wore. Raising his arms up, Sandok's blade bounced off the mountain's heavily armored forearms. While the finely tuned steel of his Valyrian blade may have found purchase, Sandok was now only armed with the sword of a common man. The mountain continued his own assault, punching and grabbing, but landing only on air, as the Shadow dodged each of the attacks. Sandok launched his next strike high overhead. As Gregor's arms came up to deflect the blow, Sandok then arced the blade downward, and then quickly up, missing the mailed forearm and penetrating into the exposed armpit of the mountain. Gregor howled and brought his fist down hard onto Sandok's shoulder. The Shadow fell back and tumbled to the ground. Gregor cursed and yanked the blade free from his flesh, which drew out another hail of obscenity. He tossed the blade at the Shadow, laying motionless on the ground. The blade thumped against the forest floor. Gregor stormed towards him. "Now, you die!" The mountain bellowed as he reined up for a massive strike, aimed squarely at the Shadow. Then, springing to action, Sandok rolled as Gregor's punch met nothing but earth. The Shadow grabbed the discarded blade and slashed Sir Gregor's face, creating a massive wound. Gregor screamed, grabbing the horrific lesion in his face with both hands, and then Sandok rammed the blade deep in his temple. The screaming stopped. Battered and bruised, Sandok retrieved his Valyrian steel blade from the grassy earth where it had fallen, holding it with only one hand as the arm Gregor had hit was completely useless and hung limply. Sandok tied the crippled limb tight to his body and then stopped for a moment to observe the carnage around him. Finally, he escaped into the darkness of the forest night. This is my interpretation of how a fight between the most legendary warriors of the known world would happen. Gregor's size and strength gives him the ability to best any ordinary man. Sandok is at least near his size, and by all accounts, vastly more skilled. When met with an opponent he can't simply overpower, Gregor has no other tools at his disposal, and in my eyes, would see defeat. Do you agree with the outcome, or do you believe that the mountain should have beaten the Shadow? Let me know in the comments, as well as if there are any other legendary warriors who you would want to see face off. If you're interested in learning more about the Game of Thrones universe, check out my podcast, Talking Dragons, where we take a lighthearted look at the world of Westeros, linked on screen here.